My name's Cyril Chandler, and this afternoon, which is on August the 20th, 2001, I'm talking to Dr. Malcolm Holliday in the series of the Oral History of Nephrology. I first came to this university, in the University of California in San Francisco, 30 years ago. Almost to the day, I had decided that I wanted to work on kidney disease in children, and I was interested as why children with kidney failure didn't grow, and it was the accepted wisdom at that time. Not only would they not grow normally, but they wouldn't mature. And the one person in the world who was interested in this and making significant contributions in this field was Mac Holliday. And so I was very fortunate to come here as a Medical Research Council visiting fellow to work with Mac, and that started a long friendship which continues to this day. So Mac, we're going to talk about the history of pediatric nephrology and your part in it. I happen to know that you qualified as a doctor at the ridiculous early age of, I think, 22. So we might start as to why you became a doctor in the first place.
Well, I'm afraid my reasons for going into medicine were somewhat uninspired by conventional standards. I had a lot of medical procedures when I was 3, and I blurted out I wanted to get even. And the idea of practicing, of being a doctor was sufficiently attractive, I never changed my mind. And so from that rather inauspicious beginning, I went on into medical school.
You did have a kidney removed, didn't you?
I did have a kidney removed.
And you were 3 at the time?
I was 3 at the time.
And so you're living proof of the fact that one kidney is enough.
It's been enough for me.
So you entered medical school when you were, well, you went to college when you were 16, and you entered medical school when you were 19, and you were qualified as a doctor when you were 22.
That's correct.
Why a pediatrician?
I think I found the inpatient practice of pediatrics, which is what students really see, very exciting at that time. Children were coming in sick, particularly at that period, 1945, 44, 45, with severe diarrheal dehydration. And we were able to effect a rapid response. It was dramatic. And children seemed much more sort of flexible and recoverable. And I liked it. Also, I think oftentimes is the case, the faculty in pediatrics, there were only 2 of them, were both pleasanter than the faculty in medicine, which was the other option I considered.
But during your time as a medical student, you were interested in physiology in general and fluid and electrolyte balance? That's
correct. In the first year of medical school, the professor of biochemistry introduced us to the then relatively new ideas of body fluid physiology and the composition of extracellular fluid. And then particularly he used the syllabus widely used by medical students at that time for this subject, written by James Gamble, who was then at Children's Hospital in Boston. And I found the syllabus very interesting. The idea, which was not all that common then, to speak in terms of sodium and chloride concentrations as milliequivalents per liter as opposed to milligrams percent, struck me as a good idea. And interestingly, most of my classmates didn't agree with me. They thought it was too hard to understand, but for me it was fun. When I got to Children's as an intern, I came to know of Dr. Gamble, who was then near retirement, but cast a rather large shadow over the Children's Hospital. And applied to him for a fellowship in a few years, and he was kind enough to give it to me.
So you went as a fellow into Gamble's laboratory in 1948?
2 years after I
3 years
graduated.
after,
Yeah.
2 years after
Yeah.
you graduated. And you worked there with Bill Wallace as well?
That's correct. Bill Wallace then was someone who had worked on intracellular pH in A. Baird Hastings' lab, the Department of Biochemistry at Harvard, in the mid-30s, and then when World War II came, he became engaged in the U.S. Army, serving as a battalion surgeon at the Patton's Corps, and was involved in a lot of action for a 4-year period. He came back as I was doing my internship, and I found him a very appealing figure as a mentor, and he became a mentor for the next several years.
So he was really the sort of chief of staff of Gamble's laboratory?
That's right. He was the manager of the laboratory. His interest and contribution at that time was to develop a means for measuring sodium and potassium by a then new idea of flame photometry. And we developed one out of homemade equipment, which could do an amazing 15 or 20 sodiums and potassiums in an afternoon, as opposed to the 3 or 4 if you did it gravimetrically. It was an advance. I think it gave the lab a little bit of a start at that time, since we had both.
Do you ever have to get out of bed at night to measure potassium or sodium?
Did I?
Yes.
Yes. I had to get out of bed at night to measure a lot of things during my student days. I had a lab externship, it was called, which meant you did emergency work at night.
Using the flame photometer?
No, it wasn't available then. We had to.
But later on?
Later on.
So what would you say Dr. Gamble's main contribution was?
Dr. Gamble's contribution was quite singular. In 1923, he published a paper which involved a study of 4 children who were fasted, and he collected urine from them. Remember, there's no intake, so that the balance study was much more simpler and easier. And he followed the changes in extracellular fluid volume, rather in concentration, and showed how stable they were in spite of the stress of fasting. What he really did was introduce clinical medicine to the concept of extracellular fluid, which was a major achievement. It introduced physiology into the clinical practice of medicine. It was not just in pediatrics, it was picked up by medicine and surgery right away as a very important development. So for a period, he was honored by all 3 of those specialties for that contribution. And from that, he developed the syllabus, which attracted me to him in the first place. That syllabus described both the renal responses to fasting and to other stresses later, and how they protected the composition of extracellular fluid in response to various stresses. This idea, I think, came from Walter Cannon, who was sort of the founding father of physiology, the concept of homeostasis, in which he observed that many mechanisms, the body had many mechanisms for maintaining stability in the face of challenge. Gamble applied that particularly to extracellular fluid. And for the period from the 20s to the 40s, that became a cornerstone of teaching and of clinical practice in using fluid therapy to benefit people with dehydration, diabetes, and various other conditions.
But I suppose that it's not in any way surprising to us as pediatricians that the understanding of the importance of the stability of body composition should have come from a pediatric-based laboratory, because children are a much greater threat than adults.
That's true. Actually, as a young man, Gamble worked in Howland's laboratory in Baltimore, which was the first full-time department of pediatrics in a medical school. They had the first full-time department of medicine and surgery as well. And they had available a clinical laboratory devoted to clinical research in children. And Gamble, he was one of the stars of that original program. And the facilities of that laboratory allowed them to make the extraordinary measurements they made on the plasma and urine of these fasting children, which gave them the start of this whole idea.
But Gamble also, I think, understood, did he not, I think this is what I've learned from you, the importance of the kidney in the maintenance of the extracellular fluid volume and content.
That's true. In the original study and subsequent studies, he not only measured the changes in composition of plasma as the stress was imposed, but what happened in urine, and he could draw the relationship between the changes in urine composition to the defense of extracellular fluid, as he would put it. Where he sort of stumbled a little bit was that he thought of this in somewhat more teleological terms than was then becoming popular. The person who understood the role of the kidney in physiologic terms that took the process quite a bit further was Homer Smith. And Homer Smith introduced clinical medicine to an understanding of kidney physiology, and it was the bringing together of body fluid physiology and kidney physiology that was, I think, a major achievement of the 40s and 50s in both medicine and pediatrics. And as Homer Smith's program developed, he was a physiologist actually, what we now know as nephrology became renal physiology as a specialty, which is a takeoff of body fluid physiology, which Gamble had started. And that really, in a sense, is the heritage from which nephrology and pediatric nephrology ultimately emerged.
Tell me about the Salt and Water Club.
Salt and Water Club was a little club initially between people in Boston and New Haven and New York, and it had a rather distinguished membership. There were 20 people. They included some of the later big names of medicine: Lou Welt, Don Selden, Alex Leaf, Bob Schwartz, Bill Schwartz, and John I forget his name now, who was the first one to do a kidney transplant. John Merrill. And it was a very informal group. We'd meet, talk for a half a day, have supper, and go home. And you became emeritus when you left either of those cities. So I became an emeritus member at the age of 25.
They didn't have a visiting membership. What about Peters and Van Slyke?
Peters Van Slyke was a textbook first published in 1931. It summarized at that time what we knew about, I would say, body fluid physiology and metabolism. It was called clinical chemistry, quantitative clinical chemistry. It was an extraordinary book. It summarized in one volume the theoretical knowledge that we had at that time. And important to note was that Gamble provided the substance for 3 of the chapters: acid, base, sodium, potassium, chloride. And what was interesting, at that very point, they were veering towards a new nomenclature in acid-base balance, which Gamble neglected to ever adopt. And I think that impaired Gamble's later reputation because it left him with a terminology that was confusing to medical students. But certainly it didn't diminish in any way the major contribution of bringing clinical physicians' attention to extracellular fluid.
So after your time in Boston, and you were there for a year, you then went as a research fellow to Yale to work with Dr. Darrett.
That's right.
What are your memories of that?
Darrett was a good friend of Gamble's, a bit younger, quite different. Gamble was the quintessential New England, well-to-do scholar of medicine. Gamble was a Midwesterner from North Dakota. His mother was a suffragette, and he was lively, strong opinions. He was basically a very generous and kind man, but not afraid to take on the establishment. And Darrow was the first person to introduce potassium administration into clinical medicine. And that was certainly his most signal contribution, although he also described for clinicians, again, the consequences of both hypo and hypernatremia in terms of shift to water. Now those are well understood and seemingly obvious, but at that time they weren't.
But they're still responsible for significant morbidity in children.
Yes, they are, quite. And I think Darrow was, in some ways, a more committed physiologist throughout his career. His idea of teaching medical students was to teach them basic physiology, and the rest would follow. Sadly, I don't think that idea had as much substance as we all wish it had. But
it's not a bad start.
It's a good idea.
Yes, that's certainly the way I was brought up. What did you do when you were working with Dr. Darrow? What was your person?
We started an interest, I developed an interest in the lesions in the kidney that resulted from potassium deficiency. He had observed that and reported on it, both lesions in the heart and kidney. And when I was subsequently went to Indiana University, we pursued some more of those studies. Then I spent some involuntary time in the United States Army near the University of North Carolina, and Lou Welt, Bob Winters, and I did a study of potassium deficiency in the rats, and with Walt Hollander observed a concentrating defect, and that led to a series of reports on the effect of potassium deficiency on the morphology of the kidney, and that was described largely by Gene Oliver.
That's when you first met Gene Oliver?
That's when I met Gene Oliver, one of the real wonderful curmudgeons of medicine.
Tell me about him. You've told me about him many times, but just repeat it for a wider audience.
Gene Oliver was a very opinionated man, and he once said to me, "There are 6 frauds in medicine, and I know who they are." And he listed them for me, but fortunately I've lost the letter. One of them I had to agree with, but I won't say any more than that. But he took the art of microdissection of the kidney to isolate nephrons to quite a level, and later became associated with Carl Gottschalk, who took it yet further, so that both proximal and distal nephrons in mammals were identified, and sites of lesions were identified, and that became some of the background, I think, for the micropuncture studies that followed. Certainly it did for Carl Gottschalk. So that I think we're witnessing the transition of medical research from sort of empirical observations to the development of a physiological-based, anatomical-based demonstration that correlated clinical findings with measurable consequences or measurable underlying results.
So we established that you became a pediatrician because pediatricians are nice people, which I agree with, and you got interested in the kidney because the main function of the kidney is the maintenance of body composition with limits compatible with health, and your interest was in body composition. So what then took you into nephrology?
That was
it your fascination with the nephrotic syndrome, for example?
No, it was not my fascination with nephrotic syndrome, as you know. I found the nephrotic syndrome, well, part of my job as a fellow in Gamble's lab was to help measure GFR in nephrotic patients. work being done by Jack Metcalf, and I did not find that an interesting job. I found it very hard for the kids and for me. But it had to be done, and it was interesting work. It just didn't interest me a lot. Nonetheless, the nephrotic syndrome was an interesting problem because you had edema formation in children under conditions in which their plasma volume was contracted in many instances. And that had to do with the total amount of protein they lost. And as you know, on rare occasions can even cause shock, even though they become edematous.
I do remember that, because there was a moment in my life when I thought I discovered the fact that children became profoundly hypovolemic, sometimes in nephrotic syndrome. And that was when I was at the Hospital for Sick Children in London. We had a child whose hematocrit rose 21. But I went to the library and found that you'd already written on the subject many years earlier in the American Journal of Diseases of Children.
That's true, but that was, you know, an interesting observation, and then you went on.
But so it's not nephrotic syndrome. So it's
No, it was, I think, given the lesions we saw in potassium deficiency and the interest I had acquired from my experience with Gene Oliver, and seeing children with various kinds of kidney disease, notably obstructive uropathy and disorders of development, that they developed some very interesting lesions. For example, they developed renal tubular acidosis, they developed a renal acidosis, they developed a polyuria, they developed salt wasting, different ones sorted out with different problems. So it became part of the clinician's job is to find out what that child needed to sustain ability. I remember a child in Pittsburgh who the extraordinary requirement of 30 grams of salt a day to sustain his extracellular fluid volume. He had a GFR less than 10, and if he missed a couple of doses, he would come into the hospital in shock. That was a fairly dramatic example of renal function gone wrong. At the same time, we were beginning to see, or we were seeing children with renal failure, and noting that Scribner in Seattle was beginning a chronic dialysis program for adults, and a transplant program was developing with John Merrill at the Brigham. That it seemed to me we should perhaps see what we could do for children.
So we're now in the mid-1960s. You've survived the US Army. You've been to Pittsburgh. You've worked as a career investigator in the United States Public Health Service. And in 1963, you came to California. And after a brief period in Children's Hospital in Oakland, you came to the University of California, Moffitt Hospital, San Francisco, where we're sitting in, what, 1960?
1966.
1966. And that's when you began interested seriously in growth, failure, and the endocrine and metabolic changes that are the consequence of renal insufficiency.
Yes, I think one of the things that had struck me even much earlier was that some of the children with kidney disease were remarkably growth retarded. Cystinosis is the extreme example. And the reason for that did intrigue me. Salt wasting appeared to be one of the causes in some children. I think a form of nephrogenic diabetes insipidus seemed to be another, where the water requirement was so high. And then we got interested in renal failure, and that's when you came to the laboratory, and we began to look at the problem of calorie deficiency. And that seemed to be one of the many factors that impaired growth.
Yes, I suppose that the wonderful year I had, where I learnt quite a lot about renal physiology, more than I ever expected to learn about American history and the University of Virginia. But I left with a very clear view in my own mind that there wasn't a single cause of growth failure, but it was the consequence of the many changes in body composition that are the consequence of renal insufficiency, and the adaptations that have to take place in order to maintain life in the face of renal failure.
I think from Homer Smith, the idea emerged that the kidney was the organ that let primitive man's, other animals, survive on what they could forage when they could get it, and that they would have periods of relative absence of food and the concept of fasting, as Gamble studied. And that required adaptations, and the kidney was a very important part of that adaptive response. As we got more affluent and people had food all the time, it sort of allowed us the privilege of eating whatever we wanted to, whenever we wanted to. But with the contraction of kidney function, the loss of kidney function, that option began to narrow. And the extreme example was the adults or children who had clearances of 5% of normal, who some people were managing to sustain by very careful dietary management. An important example of that was Tom Addis at Stanford. He wrote a book called Glomerulonephritis. In it, he described the management of a young man with progressive renal failure and his ultimate death, but how important dietary protein was, how important calories were, basically how important managing his dietary intake was. And I think that was part of the inspiration from my own observations.
One of course, the main difference that the pediatrician has in managing children with, particularly young children, renal failure, is that it's not possible to directly control intake. I mean, you can say to some adults, and I guess in the 60s and 70s they did, that if you don't eat this diet, you will die, and that's an egg a day or 20 grams of protein. But if you say that to a child, the child will say, well, so, all right, I'll die. And so what we had to do was to develop the notion that you had to maintain energy intake and then start modifying the intake of other nutrients in a way which is acceptable to the child.
You know, it provokes another idea that I should mention, because I am forever indebted, and I think pediatricians are generally, to social workers who understood the impact of disease on children and their families. You may remember a particular social worker that worked with us, Carol Levin.
Yes. Yeah.
Who was just marvelous in making that point, and fussing at us to make sure we understood the family, the burden on the family. And I think that's an important contribution to medicine, is to understand the consequences to the family of sickness in children.
And it's also the role of other members of what's now an overused word, the clinical team.
Mm-hmm.
That I think anybody who's worked with children with renal failure knows that it's not possible to do a good job unless you are working with a strong team of social workers and nutritionists, dietitians.
Correct.
Because if you are to persuade a child to modify their intake in a way which doesn't destroy the family, then you need to work with the child.
That certainly proved to be the case. You know, Carol was particularly gifted, and she made a tape of one particular child I remember who talked about dreaming of watermelons and steaks raining down on him, both of which he was not supposed to eat. And another child talking about, oh, well, we all cheated a little bit. And you got an insight into the fact that these were normal children faced with a tremendous stress. And initially in 1967, when we started, there was no Medicare to provide funds for this. We had a very small program we could train 2 children at a time for home dialysis. same program could train 10 adults at a time, and that was the sole dialysis capacity in Northern California, and much beyond California for that matter. At the same time, they were just doing their first kidney transplants at UCSF around 1965-66, and we started slipping them children, and they seemed to like it. I think we trained 4 transplant surgeons in the art and science of dealing with children and their parents who needed kidney transplants, and it was fun.
I don't know whether you agree with me that, I mean, dialysis, whilst wonderful because it saved children's lives, was always a completely unsatisfactory way of living your life, and that transplantation had to be the only sensible long-term solution.
I think that emerged. I mean, I think initially I hoped, well, dialysis is a little more physiological, it demands more of the doctor and the patient, and that had a nice ring to it until you dealt with the reality of dialysis. I remember one of the kids who was learning dialysis and quite afraid of it, but was a very smart kid. His mother was not so adept. He would hide under the covers, but as his mother was about to do something, he stuck his head out and said, "No, Mama, that ain't the way." And that kid went on to become a veterinarian and to do well for a long time. As far as I know, he's still doing well. But he did well because he got a kidney transplant.
But dialysis was more complicated in children,
yes,
than in adults because of the different relationship between metabolic rate and therefore the necessity for food intake and circulation, and therefore the capacity to dialyze. And I learned about that relationship from your work on size. So perhaps you could talk about that.
Yeah, it was interesting. Even when I was measuring body water in children as my first project in Gambo's lab, we made the interesting observation in the first year of life that both surface area and body weight correlated linearly with body water, and this seemed to be a bit of an anachronism, since the surface area law hadn't been fully exploded at that time. And it turned out that in the first year of growth, weight and surface area and energy metabolism all increase pretty much at the same rate because children grow this way. And from that we devised a rather simple formula for fluid therapy throughout life that's held up pretty well. But the important
point...
Which
is weight related in a different...
change in weight relation,
yes.
Which is easy to remember. Bill Wallace once said, the way most people are trying to do it is like trying to weigh a Mack truck on an analytical balance, and you get it a little simpler than that. But the important thing, I think, related to what you say, is that a child's energy requirement are roughly 2.5 times per kilo of body weight than adults, which means the load of potassium, phosphorus, sodium that you have to control in adults, you have to control that much more in a child if you want to get the same calories in. Or you have to dialyze more, and that becomes part of the problem. And I think ultimately that's why dialysis proved even less successful in children than it did in adults. Fair number of adults have survived years on dialysis. Not many children have.
Mind you, even for adults, what is still a serious problem in long-term dialysis is calorie deficit and bone disease. I mean, many adults die of malnutrition or disabling bone disease, even now.
Well, I think, you took the bone problem a little further and showed that regulating phosphorus intake was indeed important to improving growth. And I think your evidence is quite convincing, despite the fact that some people think massive doses of vitamin D is an adequate substitute and you can have all the phosphorus you want. I guess there's a tension between those who want to regulate intake, restrict it to within the limits that are tolerable, and those who say go ahead and then find a pharmacologic means to get around it. Realistically, I guess you have to say there's something to be said for both, but I think you and I both favor trying to keep the physiological intake more normal.
Yes, as long as the price you pay for it, or the child pays for it, is not unacceptable. And but this notion that you can just dialyse children harder and not manage their energy, their food intake, never strikes me as sensible, because you are always working at the limit of dialysis surface area and circulatory volume.
Dialysis of the various forms is kidney function at about 5% level. That's not measured in simple clearance. That's not much of tolerance. Kidney function at 5% level is marginal at best. And with dialysis and its rather crude approach, it's even less, but it does work.
And I suppose the same argument applies to the use of growth hormone, that whilst large dose of growth hormone will improve growth undoubtedly in children with renal failure, that shouldn't be taken as a simplistic solution to not bothering with any other things that you need to manage, like intake. Because certainly I think you can manage children with chronic renal failure without growth hormone, erythropoietin, not to at least a quite significantly reduced GFR, and that saves you money, but also I think improves the health of the child.
Yeah, I think part of this gets down to, both in the case of the child, the parent, the doctor, how much they're willing to participate in some restrictive regimen to enjoy better health, as opposed to do what you please and find a pharmacologic way around it. Sometimes that works, but sometimes it doesn't. There is, being old Calvinists, I guess, we think there's some virtue in the discipline of restraint.
Yeah, we have had a very good lunch.
That's true. But we don't have kidney disease either.
Can we go on to talking about services? Because I came to work with you in 1971, in the autumn of 1971, by which time there was a strong dialysis and particularly strong transplant program here, and you were very concerned about how that service, the same sort of access to the service, might be organized across the whole United States. And I remember you were making many trips to Washington at the time.
Well, that's true. I mean, I was a pediatrician on the committee of the National Kidney Foundation on dialysis transplant. And the government was on the verge of passing what became the Medicare amendment to pay for dialysis transplant, but it hadn't happened yet. And the very social worker I mentioned to you and the psychologists who worked with her and the nutritionists had indoctrinated us in the importance of providing general, far broader services than visits to clinic could provide. Now, as the programs for dialysis transplant began to be funded by government, we tried to build those into the service as part of a national program. And coincident with that was to maintain a registry with good data. As you know, we were not successful, and you were, and I commend you for it. The dialysis transplant registry in both adults and in later in children that you founded has proved to be a valuable source of information. And I'm afraid the former colonies were a little deficient at that point.
Well, I'm afraid it's not turned out quite like that, because in fact the European registry, which did do wonderful work for the first maybe 30 years, then collapsed and is now having to be reinvented, whereas you have invented and carried through a very good registry for children now.
That's good to hear.
But why do you think the sort of network of centres that you were hoping to develop was not a way forward that the United States felt able to take?
I suppose the United States represents a very different problem from the UK and Europe in general. It's a large country, long distances for a lot of patients. And it's got a psychology that's different. Every medical school wanted to have its program. At the time you're talking about, our calculation were that a pediatric program in 20 medical schools would provide the needed services and also assure the needed experience to develop a good, rational approach. I think the truth is that when every medical school tried to do it, they wound up having 1 or 2 pediatric nephrologists working, trying to find enough patients to sustain the program, yet always being on call. And to me, that was an exhausting and debilitating effect of lack of organization and promotion of individualism in medicine that is characteristic of our country, but I think a serious flaw in the way it develops medical services generally, and specifically the way it develops medical services here. The argument that's been made to me, particularly as applied to adults, is that making it generally available and readily funded, they served a whole lot more adults than they might have. And I suppose that's true, but somehow or other I think the dialysis program and the funding consequences of it for adults was part of the process of medicine changing from a service organization to a business organization. And I personally lament that change, although people disagree with me, as you don't know.
Well, as you say, I certainly watched what you were planning to do, and we talked a lot about it. And when I got back to England, Martin Bowdickwhite and I wrote a program based on those same ideas of the United Kingdom.
And you did it.
Well, it took a while, but eventually the government decided that renal failure services for children would be provided, and they did so on the basis of a limited number of centres that had the proper backup, which had to include a close association with the adult services, because I think that's a very necessary relationship.
Yeah, I think there's an interdependency in the case of pediatrics between nephrology and pediatric nephrology, which got lost in this country again because of this compulsion to be independent on your own. And I think the internists were not particularly interested in children once they saw it wasn't a funding source, and the pediatricians were doing it. And pediatricians, they just never developed the kind of relationship that I think would have benefited both. Because I think internists could learn a lot from watching the way pediatricians manage families, or at least I thought so at that time. Times marched on, so it was 30 years ago, and obviously it's irrelevant now.
I think a lot of nephrologists, we'd call them adult nephrologists, have been interested in services for children and been immensely beneficial. Certainly I've had that experience in London. But what about pediatric nephrologists? Because I guess we don't know when pediatric nephrology started, but it certainly wasn't around when you were born, nor when I was born, and I don't think it was around when I became one, but it is certainly around now with training programs. But you've seen pediatric nephrology develop, and in fact you played some part in developing training programs for and in systematizing it nationally, if not internationally.
In 1968, when nephrology was just getting started, it seemed to me, based on my experience on the national scene with dealing with internists as well as pediatricians, that adhering to the belief that pediatricians are the best people to take care of children because of the various unique social problems children have, that pediatricians would have to learn to manage end-stage renal disease. To do that, they would have to form their own subspecialty board. Well, a lot of people who resented that, thinking they were barely accepting of the fact that pediatricians could establish a specialty. But a board was formed, and it took 2 or 3 years to finally get off the ground. But exams are given. And
well, you were in the first group to take the exams, weren't you? Cause you
no, I actually wrote the first exams.
But you had to take the adult exam
That's
to be
right.
allowed to take it.
It was easy. And we wrote exams for pediatricians, and several pediatricians made snide remarks about us forcing them to take exams, but I think, for better or for worse, that's where pediatric nephrology established itself in this country. I think you can speak for the UK and Europe much better than I can, how they manage that. But I think one of the peculiar things about our country is we start these things, we don't give a lot of thought to long-term consequences, but we do get things started, and then other people look at them, start them a little better. And I think that happened in Europe, because as I see pediatric nephrology programs in Europe, including the UK, they seem to work much better than those in this country.
Well, I don't know, I think it's...
Some better, anyhow.
The grass looks greener on the other side
Maybe.
of the ocean. but I mean, pediatric nephrology now is a sort of worldwide enterprise, but still small enough for us to know what each other's doing and actually to develop and maintain friendships like you and I have done.
That's certainly true. I've been struck at the international meetings that I attended, which I haven't done for a few times now, that we could all get in one room, and it would be under 1,000 as a rule, and that included Japan, an extraordinary number.
Yes.
All of Europe, some of China now, South America, and now Africa is coming in. I have to give the IPNA, I hope I have those initials right.
You do?
Credit for bringing in people from what was then the Iron Curtain, behind the Iron Curtain, to those meetings. I remember some very dramatic moments when people from Czechoslovakia or Russia would come to meetings, and it was an eye-opening experience for them, and I think helped them get started with their programs. Now, it's how we deal with chronic disease in children has been a small part of how we deal with chronic disease in adults in countries where economic resources are very limited. It still bothers me. I mean, I don't know what to do about that. I know
And I suppose it's the unresolved question that as technology develops, becomes widely available, the questions become not what can be done, but what should be done. And those are questions that have to be examined at the extremes of life in particular.
It's true. It's very hard, however, because it's always changing, so that dialysis became much more efficient, much easier to do in adults, so they could extend it to a whole lot more people. And that seemed to work despite my dire predictions to the contrary. And I think this whole notion that if you believe in equity, then do you believe in equity beyond the boundaries of your country where there's resources? Take it into countries where there aren't resources. You remember in the textbook Pediatric Nephrology, we had a section that was a little controversial one time called From Around the World. But I noticed that's taken hold now, and it seems to be a fixed part of the book. And I think it's important, because getting people from other countries to tell us what their problems are reminds us that Western medicine is not the only medicine. In fact, many more children live in the world beyond Western boundaries than live in it. And I think that is a credit to the IPNA that they recognize that.
And that medicine has to be efficient, effective, and economic, so that as many people as possible can benefit from it. Did you enjoy editing the textbook? For the sake of posterity, I should point out there is one major textbook of pediatric nephrology.
Yes,
did you
I
enjoy
did.
your time editing?
I did. I mean, for one thing, it gave me a chance to recruit people from truly around the world to write a chapter. Many chapters I learned a great deal as I edited them. And it was a very camaraderie, a very warm experience in a lot of instances. To my amazement, some I rather drastically rewrote did not bring down curses upon me, but actually a couple of thank you notes. So yeah, I enjoyed it.
Well, there's one thing worse than having a chapter rewritten for you, and that's being asked to rewrite it yourself. So I suppose that's understandable. The book itself seemed to me to, during your time as the editor, to reflect both your approach and your career, and that all the conditions, particularly those relating to renal insufficiency, were approached from, first of all, understand the physiology, then understand how that is affected by the disease, then you move into the management. Would you say
That's certainly true, and I think the other thing we tried to emphasize was the sociologic aspects of it, which, as well as body comp. I mean, if you remember, I think they've dropped it now, but the early editions focused on the body first and the kidney second. I still rather like that.
Yeah, so do I.
But I think we've lost.
Yes, maybe we have.
But they still talk about the body as though it really is there.
Well, now, is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to add?
No, I don't think so. I very much appreciate being asked to do this. I'm not sure how useful it'll be, but I think for pediatricians and even nephrologists, general nephrologists, I refer to them as general nephrologists. I'm an adult who happens to be a pediatric nephrologist. To understand the primitive origins of this field began with understanding that there was such a thing as extracellular fluid, and that pediatricians were the people who brought that out back in the 20s. And that the development of renal physiology was a natural consequence of that, and you need to honor the people who did that, who were largely internists. And then came the approach to treat patients with no kidneys at all. I do remember the first meeting of the Salt and Water Society that you mentioned. Bill Wallace, who could also at times be a sort of amateur philosopher, saying, in some exasperation, pretty soon we're going to have bodiless kidneys and kidneyless bodies. And within a short period of time, we did. We perfused kidneys and studied the urine excreted therefrom and learned from it. And we certainly had kidneyless bodies as we dialyze people. So maybe that's an appropriate point to end on.
Malcolm Holliday, thank you very much.